The first tremor began not in the flesh, but in the silence. It was a subtle shift in the apartment's atmospheric pressure, a hum beneath the audible spectrum that only Elian's bones could register. The recycled air, usually so sterile it was a scentless void, suddenly seemed to thicken, to cling to the back of his throat like a film of dust. It was the precursor, the quiet intake of breath before the scream. He stood before the expansive chromaglass window, his reflection a pale, indistinct smear against the city's geometric lattice of light and shadow. Below, transport glided along prescribed magnetic lines, their movements silent, orderly, and utterly predictable. Everything was predictable, especially this. The low, insistent ache began to coil in his spine, a serpent of heat unspooling from its dormant state. It was a familiar pain, a biological harbinger that carried with it the metallic taste of dread. His skin grew taut, a size too small for the fever building beneath it. He could smell himself. That was always the true sign. The neutral, state-sanctioned scent blocker he wore, a second skin of chemical nullity, was beginning to fail. Through its carefully engineered matrix, the first notes of his own fragrance were pushing through, sweet and desperate, the scent of blooming nightshade, of honey and ruin. It was a traitorous perfume, an olfactory signal flare he could not extinguish. He was a beacon, and the signal was meant for only one receiver, one who had no right to answer. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the cool, unyielding glass. The city's indifferent glow pulsed against his eyelids. He tried to regulate his breathing, to master the rhythm of his own blood, but it was a fool's errand. His body was a vessel for a storm he did not command. The system had promised control, had built a world on the foundation of biological regulation and social harmony. Suppressants, blockers, scheduled cycles. They had dissected the chaos of instinct and laid it out in neat, manageable charts. Yet here he was, a glitch in their perfect code, a ghost haunting the machine. His heat was not a neat, scheduled event. It was a haunting. It arrived with the memory of a touch, the echo of a voice, the phantom weight of a bond that was supposed to be erased, a bond that had been overwritten, stamped over with the seal of another's claim, yet its roots remained, buried deep in his marrow, tangled around his soul. The apartment was a monument to sterility. The walls were a soft, non-reflective grey. The furniture, molded from a single piece of synthetic polymer, was designed for function, not comfort. There were no photographs, no personal effects, nothing to betray a history, a life lived outside the designated parameters. It was a holding cell, disguised as a home, and on days like this, the disguise wore thin. He was not an asset. He was not a designation. He was a man coming undone. A small circular light on the wall shifted from cool blue to a soft, warning amber. The chronometer. 72 hours until projected cycle peak. The system was always watching, always measuring. It knew the fever was building. It would allocate resources, flag his status as compromised, and wait for the resolution. The resolution always came. He turned from the window, his movements stiff, his joints aching with a preternatural weight. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was expectant. It held the shape of an impending presence. He could almost feel the displacement of air, the subtle dip in the floor plates that would signal an arrival. He walked to the small kitchen alcove, his bare feet making no sound on the seamless floor. He poured a glass of water, his hand shaking so badly that droplets beaded on the counter. The water was chilled, tasteless, but it did nothing to cool the fire in his veins. He drank it down, focusing on the simple, mechanical act. Swallow, breathe, swallow. Do not think of the scent of ozone and cold stone. Do not remember the weight of a hand on the back of your neck. Do not yearn for the voice that broke you. The amber light on the wall pulsed, a slow, steady heartbeat counting down the moments to his dissolution. He thought of Dr. Aris, of the clinical kindness in his eyes, of the vials of experimental serum he'd offered. A permanent solution, Elian. A severance. The thought was a lifeline and a terror. To cut the cord would be to silence the echo, but what would be left in its place? A quiet so profound it might be its own form of madness. He had refused. Not yet. He wasn't strong enough to choose that silence. He was still weak enough to hope. It was a pathetic hope, a weed growing in the cracks of his composure. But it was his. The scent was stronger now, filling the small space, clinging to the fabric of his tunic. Honey and ash, a plea and a surrender. His knees felt weak. He braced himself against the counter, knuckles white. The city outside continued its silent, indifferent ballet. The lights of the transports were cold stars, distant and uncaring. He was utterly alone in his own body, a passenger to its treasonous needs. He was a paradox, a broken thing that still functioned, a lock whose key had been given to another, yet the original still fit. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. Kyle had made his choice. He had placed his mark, the ultimate declaration of an alpha's possession and protection, on the pristine canvas of another Omega's skin. Reese, a perfect, placid Omega, with a gentle scent of rain and white petals, a perfect match according to the system's compatibility metrics, a success story. And Elian? Elian was the rough draft, the failed experiment, the loose data point that should have been deleted. He was the before. Reese was the after. And yet, the amber light on the wall pulsed faster. He could feel it now, a distinct vibration through the floor, a thrumming that resonated with the frantic pulse in his own throat. It was not the building's systems. It was a proximity alert, a signal triggered by a specific biosignature, a signature coded to this residence, a signature that should have been rescinded. The final damning chime echoed through the silent apartment. It was a soft, melodic tone, engineered to be unobtrusive, but to Elian it sounded like a death knell. He didn't move. He simply stood, hands pressed flat against the cold counter, and listened. The whisper of the doors sliding open, the subtle shift in air current, and then the scent, ozone and cold, hard stone, the scent of absolute control, the scent of the alpha who owned the key. Kale was here. Kale stepped across the threshold, and the apartment's carefully maintained neutrality was immediately compromised. His presence was a physical force, sucking the air from the room, commanding the space with an effortless authority that was as much a part of him as the color of his eyes. The door slid shut behind him with a soft, final hiss, sealing them in. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a tall, severe silhouette against the muted light of the corridor. He wore the dark, minimalist uniform of a system regulator, its clean lines and stark fabric only accentuating the rigid control he held over himself. But Elian could feel the truth beneath the composure. He could feel the low thrum of Kale's power, the possessive growl that vibrated in the alpha's chest, a sound felt rather than heard. It was a response to his own scent, the honey and ruin that now saturated the air, a siren song of Omega distress that Kale was biologically incapable of ignoring, or perhaps unwilling. Elian finally turned, his movements slow, deliberate, a fragile attempt to project a calm he did not feel. He met Kale's gaze across the sterile expanse of the room. Kyle's eyes were the color of a winter storm, a deep, turbulent gray that revealed nothing and consumed everything. There was no warmth in them, no apology, only a chilling, predatory focus. "You shouldn't be here," Elian said. His voice was a rasp, a thin, brittle thing in the heavy silence. It was the wrong thing to say. It was a plea disguised as a command, an admission of weakness. Kyle's lips tilted in a semblance of a smile, a minute shift of muscle that held no humor. "And yet I am," he replied, his voice a low baritone, smooth and measured. It was the voice of reason, of authority, the voice that had once whispered promises against his skin and had later delivered clinical, cutting verdicts. He took a step forward, and Elian flinched, a full-body recoil that was pure instinct. Shame burned hot in his gut, a useless emotion. Kale's gaze flickered over him, an assessment. He saw the sheen of sweat on Elian's brow, the tremor in his hands, the faint flush rising on his neck. He was reading Elian's body like a data slate, cataloging the symptoms of the approaching heat. "Your cycle is early," Kale stated. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, as if Elian's biology had deliberately inconvenienced him. "My body is not a chronometer you can calibrate," Elian shot back, the words sharper than he intended. Defiance was a reflex, the last bastion of a self that was rapidly dissolving. Kale's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, passed through his storm-grey eyes. "It is a variable that requires management," he said, his tone clipped, precise. He was a regulator. Everything was a variable to be managed, including the omega he had discarded. The scent of ozone and stone intensified, laced with the sharp, aggressive tang of an alpha's rising territoriality. It was a suffocating presence, designed to soothe and dominate, and Elian's traitorous body responded to it, a deep, shuddering sigh escaping his lips against his will. The ache in his spine sharpened, radiating through his limbs, turning his bones to liquid heat. He hated it. He hated this weakness, this pre-programmed surrender. He was not a machine. He was not a program responding to a command. He was a man. He was a man drowning. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp as glass. Kyle, years ago, in this very room, before the grey walls and sterile furniture, when it had been a home. His scent had been a comfort then, a shield against the world. He'd wrapped Elian in his arms, pressing his face into the curve of Elian's neck, his low growl a promise of safety as the heat had taken hold. "I'm here," he had murmured, his voice thick with a tenderness Elian no longer believed had ever been real. "I will always be here." The memory was a poison. It made the present unbearable. "He is waiting for you," Elian said, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. He would not say the name. Reese. The name was a wound. "Your Omega. The one you marked." The words hung in the air, a deliberate provocation. He wanted to see a reaction, guilt, remorse, anything other than this cold, unassailable composure. For a moment, Kale's stillness was absolute. The air crackled with a tension that was almost visible. Then he moved. He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides, stopping just before him. Elian had to tilt his head back to meet his gaze. The proximity was overwhelming. Kale's scent was a physical weight, pressing down on him, and the heat radiating from the alpha's body called to the fever in his own. Reese is where he should be, Kale said, his voice dropping lower, a dangerous softness. Safe, stable. His cycles are predictable. The comparison was a deliberate cruelty, a scalpel sliding between Elian's ribs. You are not safe. You are not stable. You are unpredictable. He was chaos. Reese was order. Then go back to your order, Elian whispered, his resolve crumbling. The fight was leaving him, replaced by the crushing weight of biological imperative. His own scent was thickening, turning sweeter, a desperate, final plea. Help me. Claim me. End this. Kale raised a hand, and Elian flinched again, squeezing his eyes shut. He expected a blow, a shove, some physical manifestation of the alpha's displeasure. Instead, he felt the cool touch of Kale's fingers against his feverish cheek. The gesture was shockingly gentle. It was a clinical touch, an assessment of his temperature, yet it sent a tremor of longing so powerful through Elian that his legs threatened to buckle. The bond is an echo, Elian, Kyle said, his voice a murmur against Elian's ear. He hadn't realized the alpha had moved closer still. A residual data signature. It requires periodic maintenance to prevent system corruption. System corruption. That's what he was. Not a person, not a former lover. A potential error message in Kyle's perfect code. The cold, clinical words should have enraged him, should have given him the strength to push Kyle away. But the heat was stealing his reason, and the alpha's touch, his scent, his nearness were all part of a powerful, narcotic equation his body was desperate to solve. He was losing. He was already lost. His head fell back, exposing the pale, vulnerable line of his throat, an offering he hadn't meant to make. Kyle's grey eyes darkened, the predator stirring beneath the regulator's mask. The echo of the bond, faint as it might be, was singing between them. And Kyle, the master of control, was listening to the music. The peak had broken, as it always did, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage. The silence that descended in Kyle's absence was different from the one that had preceded him. It was a hollow, ringing void, thick with the ghost of his scent and the lingering shame of surrender. Elian lay curled on the floor, the cool polymer a stark contrast to his overheated skin. Every muscle ached with the brutal aftermath of the fever, a deep, cellular exhaustion that felt less like relief and more like defeat. The apartment was a mess, a cushion torn from the sofa, a glass shattered on the floor, small, violent testaments to a struggle that had been entirely internal. Kale had been methodical, efficient. He had weathered the storm of Elian's heat with a chilling detachment, his actions precise, aimed at calming the biological imperative with the least amount of emotional engagement possible. He was a physician treating a symptom, not a lover tending to his partner. When the fever had finally receded, he had simply withdrawn, dressed himself in the oppressive silence of his uniform, and left. No words of comfort, no lingering touch, just the soft, mechanical hiss of the door sliding shut, a sound of finality that was anything but. The cycle would repeat. This was not an end. It was a pause. With a groan, Elian forced himself to his feet. His body felt alien, a vessel that had been used and discarded. He moved through the small apartment with the slow, deliberate motions of the convalescent, gathering the debris. He picked up the torn cushion, his fingers tracing the ripped seam. He swept the shards of glass into a dustpan, the tiny, sharp sounds grating against his raw nerves. He stripped the rumpled sheets from the sleeping platform. He had to erase the evidence. He had to scrub the scent of ozone and stone from his life. A futile ritual he performed every cycle. He initiated the sanitation protocol. Thin streams of vapor hissed from vents in the walls, filling the room with a cleansing fog that smelled of antiseptic and ozone, a different, sterile ozone that fought to neutralize the alpha's lingering territorial scent. He stood under the water synthesizer in the bathing unit, the temperature just short of scalding, and scrubbed at his own skin until it was raw and red. He was trying to wash away more than just sweat and scent. He was trying to wash away the memory of Kyle's hands on him, the feeling of his own body's eager, humiliating betrayal. He was not a possession. He was not a duty. He was not a residual data signature. He repeated the words to himself, a mantra against the truth. The truth was that as long as this biological tether remained, he was all of those things. The amber light on the wall had returned to its placid, unobtrusive blue. The system was satisfied. The anomaly had been contained. His status would be updated from compromised to stable. He was once again a functioning cog in the great silent machine. Later that day, a notification chimed on his terminal. Mandatory post-cycle assessment. Facility 7, 14 Staharosans. There was no option to decline. He dressed in a fresh, nondescript grey tunic, the standard civilian attire. He applied the scent blocker, a cool gel that felt like a layer of ice against his still sensitive skin. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen of the terminal. A pale face, hollowed eyes, a mouth set in a grim line. A ghost. Facility 7 was like every other state building, a monument of white ferrocrete and smoked glass, silent and imposing. Inside, the air was chilled and smelled of the same antiseptic used in his apartment's sanitation cycle. He checked in with a silent automaton, pressing his thumb to a scanner that read his identity and vital signs. He was directed to a waiting room where others like him sat in evenly spaced chairs, staring at nothing. Omegas, all of them, their faces blank, their postures radiating a quiet, systemic exhaustion. Dr. Aris's office was a small oasis of humanity in the sterile facility. There were physical books on a shelf, a rare, almost decadent affectation, and a small, living plant on his desk, its green leaves a startling splash of color in the monochrome world. Dr. Aris himself was a kind-faced man, his eyes holding a weary empathy that was dangerously unprofessional in their line of work. "Elian," he said, his voice gentle. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "The system flagged your cycle as acute." A delicate, clinical euphemism. Acute, violent, desperate. "It was," Elian replied, his voice flat. He did not want to talk about it. He did not want to relive it. Dr. Aris steepled his fingers, his gaze steady. "The regulator's signature was logged at your residence. Kyle." He said the name without inflection, but Elian still flinched. "Standard procedure for unbonded omegas experiencing pre-suppressant cycle distress," Elian recited, the official jargon a bitter taste in his mouth. "Not for an omega whose former alpha is bonded and marked to another," Dr. Aris corrected softly. "That is not standard procedure. That is a systemic anomaly, one that his superiors seem content to ignore, as long as the situation is managed." The doctor sighed, leaning forward. He lowered his voice, a gesture of confidentiality that was both comforting and alarming. "I am offering you a way out of this cycle, Elian, a way out of him." He slid a small metallic case across the desk. Elian stared at it. He knew what it was, the experimental severance treatment. "We spoke of this before. The serum is ready for human trials. It's designed to target the specific neural pathways and pheromonal receptors that form the basis of a partial or broken bond. It will dissolve the echo. It will silence his call. Silence. The word was a siren's song. A life without the dread, without the humiliating need, without the periodic violation of his home and his body. A life that was entirely his own. But fear was a powerful anchor. The side effects, Elian said, his voice barely a whisper. The risks are significant, Dr. Aris admitted, or his honesty a cold comfort. Neurological dissociation, emotional blunting, anhedonia. In essence, we would be burning out a part of your brain. We cannot be certain what else might be lost in the fire. To feel nothing. Would that be better than feeling this? The agony of the heat, the shame of the surrender, the hollow ache of the aftermath. Perhaps an empty room was better than a haunted house. He looked at the doctor, at the genuine concern in his eyes. Dr. Aris was offering him a choice. In a world of mandates and regulations, a genuine choice was the rarest and most terrifying thing of all. I need more time to think, Elian said, pushing the case back across the desk. Dr. Aris nodded, his expression unreadable. The choice is yours, Elian. But ask yourself, how many more times can you let him rewrite your life? The question followed him out of the sterile facility, a persistent echo in the quiet landscape of his mind. The apartment Kale shared with Reese was an architectural hymn to tranquility. It was located in the upper spires of the city, where the air was thinner and cleaner, and the chroma glass walls offered a panoramic, godlike view of the precise glittering grid below. The light inside was always soft, calibrated to mimic a perfect dawn or a gentle dusk. The scent was a carefully curated blend of Reese's natural fragrance, rain, white petals, and the subtle, calming notes of sandalwood diffused from hidden vents. It was a space designed for harmony, a testament to a successful, system-sanctioned union. Kale stood by the window, mirroring the posture Elian had held in his own stark apartment. But the view from here was not a cage, it was a kingdom. He stared down at the silent, orderly flow of transport, his reflection a sharp, imposing figure against the vastness of the sky. He had just returned. Reese met him at the door, his smile as soft and gentle as the light. "You were gone long," Reese said, his voice a quiet melody. He reached up to straighten the collar of Kyle's uniform, his touch light, unquestioning. "System maintenance," Kyle replied, the lie smooth and practiced. He allowed the touch, registered the faint, clean scent of his marked Omega, a scent that should have brought him a sense of peace, of rightness. It did not. It felt like a layer of static over a deeper, more resonant frequency. Reese's presence was a placid lake. Elian's was a storm surge. One was manageable. The other was thus necessary. He felt the lingering traces of Elian's heat on him, a phantom fever beneath his own skin, the ghost of that desperate honey and ash scent clinging to his senses. He had already initiated his uniform sanitation cycle, but the memory of it was harder to purge. He had gone there out of necessity. That is what he told himself. Alien's unstable cycles were a threat to the system's order. His distress signals, if left unanswered, could trigger sympathetic reactions in other, less stable Omegas in his sector. His intervention was a civic duty. It was a neat, logical explanation that fit perfectly within the parameters of his role as a regulator. It was also a lie. He could have dispatched a standard response unit, a medical team equipped with sedatives and suppressants. He did not. He went himself. He always went himself. He walked past Reese into the main living area. "I need to file my report," he said, a dismissal cloaked in the language of duty. Reese nodded, his expression unwavering in its gentle acceptance. "Of course, I'll prepare the evening meal." He was the perfect Omega, compliant, caring, stable. His biochemistry was a flawless match for Kale's. The system had assured him of it. Their union was held up as an example, a showcase of the perfection that could be achieved when messy emotions were replaced by precise data. So why did it feel so hollow? Why did the sterile order of his own life feel more like a prison than Elian's desperate, chaotic existence? He sat at his terminal, the screen casting a cold blue light on his face. He brought up Elian's file. Designation: Omega. Status: unbonded. Cycle: irregular. Prone to acute distress. A list of failed suppressant therapies. A history of emotional instability. The file painted a picture of a flawed component, a defective unit. It did not capture the fire in Elian's eyes when he defied him, the stubborn pride that refused to be completely extinguished. It did not capture the way his body, even in the depths of its biological surrender, felt like a homecoming. Kale's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He was supposed to log the incident, detail the intervention, and recommend a more aggressive suppressant protocol. He should have recommended the severance procedure months ago. It was the logical, efficient solution, a permanent fix for a recurring problem. But he could not bring himself to type the order. The thought of severing that connection, that faint, damaged tether that still bound them, sent a jolt of something cold and sharp through him. It was an illogical, proprietary instinct. Elian was his, not in the way Reese was, with a formal mark and a public bond. It was something older, more fundamental, a glitch in his own programming he could not erase. He had tried. The pairing with Reese was supposed to be the final overwrite, a definitive statement of his choice. He had chosen order. He had chosen stability. He had chosen the future the system had designed for him. And in doing so, he had left Elian behind. But the past was not a file to be deleted. It was a ghost that still whispered in his blood. He remembered the day he left Elian. The confrontation had been brutal. Elian's confusion, his hurt, his rage. It had been a chaotic storm of emotion that Kyle had met with cold, unassailable logic. "Our compatibility metrics are suboptimal," he had said, the words like sterile instruments of dissection. "Your emotional volatility poses a long-term risk to social and professional stability. The system has recommended a more suitable pairing." He had believed it then. He had forced himself to believe it. Emotion was a liability. Order was strength. But standing in Elian's apartment, with Elian's desperate scent filling his lungs and Elian's feverish body trembling at his touch, the logic had fractured. He had felt the phantom sting on his own neck, where Elian's mark should have been, a mark he had never completed. He had hesitated at the final moment, pulling back, leaving the bond intentionally incomplete. A partial claim, a back door, a way to maintain a connection, a measure of control, while still being free to pursue the path of advancement the system had laid out for him. He had told himself it was a precaution. Elian was too volatile to be fully bonded to, but too compelling to be fully released. It was a calculated, selfish act, a betrayal far deeper than simply leaving him. He had crippled Elian, leaving him tethered to a ghost, unable to move on, forever bound to an alpha who would never truly claim him. He closed the file. He would log the incident as a standard intervention. He would not recommend severance. Not yet. He looked out at the perfect, orderly city. He was a guardian of this order, an architect of its control. But deep within him, a single chaotic variable remained, a variable named Elian, and he was not ready to let it go. The weeks that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of grey days and silent nights. Elian moved through his life like a phantom, his interactions with the world minimal, his thoughts turned inward. Dr. Aris's offer was a constant, low hum in the back of his mind. A way out. The words were a seed of defiance, planted in the barren soil of his resignation. He began to research. Not just the severance serum, but the very nature of the bonds themselves, delving into restricted medical archives and fragmented pre-system data he accessed through encrypted channels. The official narrative was simple. The bond was a sacred, biological imperative, a cornerstone of their society's stability. But the older texts spoke of something more complex, more fluid. They spoke of choice, of emotional connection being as vital as biological compatibility. They spoke of bonds being rejected, broken by sheer force of will. It was a language of autonomy that had been systematically erased from their culture. The system hadn't just regulated instinct, it had redefined it, turning a partnership into a transaction, a connection into a form of ownership. The serum was no longer just a medical procedure in his mind. It was a key, a weapon, a declaration of independence. He would not just erase Kale, he would reclaim a part of himself that the system had tried to legislate out of existence. His resolve was hardening, crystallizing around a cold, hard core of anger. He was tired of being a ghost in his own life, a patient etherized upon a table. The encounter happened on a public concourse, one of those vast, sterile spaces designed to facilitate the orderly movement of people without encouraging actual interaction. He was returning from a mandatory nutritional supplement dispensary when he saw them, Kale and Reese. They were standing by a public fountain, a rare aesthetic indulgence that cycled softly glowing, nutrient-rich water. The light caught in Reese's fair hair, making him look ethereal, perfect. He was smiling up at Kale, his expression one of pure, untroubled adoration. Kale had a hand resting on the small of his back, a casual gesture of possession that was as definitive as a brand. They looked like a piece of system propaganda come to life. The Alpha Protector and his Omega treasure. A perfect union, a stable future. The sight should have broken him. He had expected a surge of pain, of jealousy, of the familiar gut-wrenching despair. Instead, what he felt was a profound and chilling clarity. It was like looking at a photograph of a life he had never truly been a part of. He saw Kale not as the man who had abandoned him, but as a component of a larger machine. A man who had chosen programming over personhood. And he saw Reese not as a rival, but as another victim, a beautiful, perfect cog who did not yet know he was trapped in the same gears. Kyle's gaze swept the concourse, the habitual scanning motion of a regulator. For a heart-stopping second, their eyes met across the distance. Elian saw a flicker of something in Kyle's stormy grey eyes. Not recognition, not remorse. It was something colder. The brief, impersonal assessment of an operator checking on a malfunctioning piece of equipment. In that moment, the last vestiges of his pathetic, lingering hope died. Kale did not love him. Kale did not even hate him. Kale saw him as a problem to be managed, an error to be contained. He was an inconvenience. That was the final catalyst. The quiet, impersonal cruelty of that glance, did what all the lonely nights and humiliating surrenders could not. It set him free. He turned without a backward glance and walked away, the image of the perfect couple burning in his mind, not as a source of pain, but as a map of the prison he was about to escape. He did not go back to his apartment. He went directly to Facility 7. The automaton at the desk registered his unscheduled arrival without comment. The facility's sterile silence felt different this time. It was not oppressive. It was the quiet of a laboratory, a place of transformation. He found Dr. Aris in his office, reviewing data on a translucent screen. The doctor looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to a kind of solemn understanding when he saw Elian's face. Elian didn't need to speak. His decision was written in the set of his jaw, in the clarity of his eyes. He walked to the desk and placed his hand, palm down, on its cool surface, a gesture of finality, a commitment. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued him for so long. "I want the treatment. I want the severance." Dr. Aris watched him for a long moment, his gaze searching. He was looking for doubt, for fear, for any sign of coercion. He found none. He saw only a man who had reached the end of one road and was choosing to forge another. The doctor gave a slow, deliberate nod. He opened a drawer and retrieved the metallic case, its brushed surface gleaming under the soft light. He did not slide it across the desk this time. He stood and walked around, placing it firmly in Elian's hand. The metal was cool, heavy, the weight of his future. "The protocol is intensive," Dr. Aris said, his tone shifting to one of clinical professionalism, but with an undercurrent of warmth. "It will require you to be housed here, in the facility, for the duration. The first phase is sensory recalibration. We need to quiet the noise before we can isolate the signal." Quiet the noise. Isolate the signal. It was the language of the system, but Dr. Aris was using it to dismantle the Master's house with the Master's tools. "I understand," Elian said. And he did. He understood that he was about to step into a different kind of silence, a deeper void. But this time, it would be a silence of his own making. He was not running from the ghost anymore. He was going to exorcise it. The sensory recalibration chamber was a place outside of time. It was a small, padded room, soundproofed and light-proofed, where the only stimulus was the slow, rhythmic beat of his own heart and the faint, sterile hum of the life support systems. He was suspended in a warm, saline solution, his body weightless, his senses starved. The goal, Dr. Aris had explained, was to reset his baseline, to strip away the constant, low-level static of the world so that the severance serum could target the anomalous signal, the echo of Kale's bond, with pinpoint precision. Days bled into one another. Without light or sound, his consciousness drifted. He was untethered, floating in a warm, dark void. At first it was terrifying. The silence was a crushing weight, forcing him inward, leaving him with nothing but the landscape of his own memories. The ghosts came for him in the darkness, memories of Kyle, sharp and vivid, as if they were happening in real time. The first time they met, the scent of ozone and stone cutting through the sterile air of the training facility. The low, rumbling laugh that had been so rare and so precious. The weight of his body, the possessive heat of his skin. The memories were not just images, they were full sensory experiences, and they were agony. He felt the phantom touch, smelled the phantom scent, his body reacting with the familiar Pavlovian ache of longing. The bond was fighting back. It was a living thing, a parasite, and it did not want to be starved. The serum was administered intravenously, a slow, cool drip into the darkness. It felt like ice spreading through his veins, a clinical cold that pushed back against the fever of his memories. And then, something shifted. The memories began to warp, to fray at the edges. They lost their emotional potency, becoming like old, faded photographs. The pain was still there, but it was a distant ache, an intellectual knowledge of a wound rather than the raw, tearing agony of its infliction. He drifted deeper. He was no longer in the tank, no longer in the facility. He was somewhere else, somewhere in the synaptic space between memory and reality. He was standing in a room he recognized, the first apartment he and Kyle had shared, the one with the window that looked out over the old industrial sector. The light was golden, late afternoon. Kyle was there, younger, his face less severe. He was holding a marking kit, the sterile silver instruments gleaming. Elian was kneeling before him, neck bared, heart hammering with a mixture of terror and ecstatic anticipation. This was it, the moment of the bonding. The memory was one he had revisited 1,000 times, a sacred, painful touchstone. But this time, it was different. He was not just reliving it. He was an observer. He could see the scene from outside himself. He watched as Kale uncapped the vial of symbiotic ink, his movements precise, almost robotic. He watched him trace the lines of the mark on his skin, the initial sting of the derma stylus. He felt the familiar rush, the surge of the alpha's energy, pouring into him, the nascent bond flaring to life, hot and blinding. And then he saw it. The thing he had never seen before, had never been able to see from his own perspective. Kale hesitated. For a fraction of a second, just before delivering the final, sealing injection of his own bio-signature that would have made the bond permanent and absolute. His hand faltered. His eyes, which Elian had remembered as being filled with fierce devotion, were cold, calculating. He was looking at Elian, but he was also looking past him, at a future Elian was not a part of. He saw the minute, almost imperceptible shake of Kale's head. A decision made, a choice to hold back. Kale completed the mark, but he withheld the final, crucial element. He left a back door open for himself. He created a bond that would tether Elian to him, make him responsive to his scent, his presence, but would not legally or biologically bind Kale in return. It was not a mark of love or possession. It was a leash, a beautifully crafted, perfectly implemented instrument of control. The realization was not a thought. It was a physical impact. It slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, shattering the carefully constructed temple of his memory. The love, the devotion, the promises, all of it had been a lie. Not a lie of passion or changing feelings, but a cold, premeditated, strategic lie. He was not a failed partner. He was a successful experiment, an asset to be kept in reserve, a resource to be managed. The golden light of the memory dissolved, plunging him back into the absolute darkness of the tank. But the darkness was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with a rage so pure and cold, it burned away all the grief, all the pain, all the pathetic, lingering love. The serum wasn't just severing a bond. It was revealing a truth. And the truth was not setting him free. It was arming him. He was not a victim. He was a survivor of a calculated attack. And the war was not over. The first sign was a headache. A dull, persistent throb behind Kale's left eye, that no amount of synthesized analgesics could touch. It started the day Elian entered the recalibration chamber, though Kyle did not know that then. All he knew was that a low-level static had entered his perfectly ordered world, a discordant note in a flawless symphony. He was irritable. His focus, normally laser-sharp, kept fracturing. During a sector briefing, he found his attention drifting, his mind snagged on a sense of profound unease he could not name. He snapped at a subordinate for a minor filing error, his voice colder and sharper than usual, earning him a look of startled fear. Control was everything to him, and for the first time in years, he felt the edges of his own control beginning to fray. Reese noticed. Of course he noticed. His placid, observant nature missed nothing. "You seem tense," he said one evening, his voice soft with concern as he placed a cup of herbal infusion on the table beside Kale. The scent of chamomile and rain filled the air, a fragrance designed to soothe. It felt cloying, irritating. "I'm fine," Kyle said, his tone clipped. He did not look up from the data slate he was pretending to read. He could feel the connection, the tether to Elian, and it felt wrong. It was usually a quiet, dormant thing, a faint hum in the back of his consciousness that only grew louder when Elian's cycle approached. Now, it was a thin, high-pitched whine, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. It felt weak, distant, as if it were being deliberately dampened. A surge of proprietary anger, illogical and potent, shot through him. He tried to access Elian's file on the central network. Access denied. File sealed under Medical Privacy Protocol 7.4. He stared at the message, his disbelief quickly hardening into fury. A 7.4 protocol was reserved for high-risk experimental procedures. It required the authorization of a Level 4 physician and placed a complete information blackout around the subject. Not even a regulator could override it without a direct order from the High Council. Someone was shielding Elian from him. The unease solidified into suspicion. He cross-referenced Elian's assigned physician, Dr. Aris. Kyle knew of him, a brilliant but sentimental researcher with a reputation for pushing the boundaries of Omega care, often to the consternation of the more conservative members of the medical board. He was an advocate for autonomy, a dangerous word in their world. Kyle narrowed his eyes. Aris was behind this. He was interfering. The static in Kale's head intensified. He felt a wave of dizziness, a strange, disorienting sensation of loss. It was as if a part of his own sensory apparatus had been suddenly muffled. The faint, persistent echo of Elian's biosignature, the one he had monitored for years, was fading. The headache sharpened into a spike of pure agony, and he winced, pressing the heel of his hand against his eye. "Kale!" Reese's voice was laced with alarm. He was at Kale's side instantly, his hand hovering near his shoulder, hesitant to touch. "Are you all right?" "I said I'm fine," Kale growled, the sound a low, visceral snarl that was startlingly primal. Reese flinched back, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hurt. The perfect harmony of their home was shattered. For the first time, Kale saw a crack in Reese's placid facade. He saw the fragile Omega beneath the perfect, system-approved mate. The sight did not evoke protectiveness. It evoked impatience. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I have to go out. System business." Another lie. He needed air. He needed to think. He strode out of the apartment, leaving Reese standing alone in the soft, tranquil light, his face a mask of confusion. Kale didn't know where he was going. He just walked, his long, purposeful strides eating up the silent corridors of the upper spire. The control he had, cultivated his entire life, was slipping through his fingers like sand. The tether to Elian wasn't just a tool for control. He was forced to admit the truth to himself in the cold, silent privacy of his own mind. It was a part of him, a phantom limb, and Dr. Aris was trying to amputate it. The thought of Elian being truly free of him, of the bond being completely erased, was intolerable. It was not a logical, strategic assessment. It was a raw, possessive, gut-deep rejection of the very idea. Elian was his mistake, his secret, his chaos, and no one was going to take that away from him. His path became clear. He could not access the file. He could not get past Aris, but he knew where Elian lived. The bond may be fading, but it was not yet gone. He could still feel the faint, thin thread of it. The next time Elian's cycle was due, the signal, however weak, would pulse, and Kale would be there. He would not wait for the summons of the heat. He would go before. He would reassert his presence, his scent, his dominance. He would remind Elian's body, and Elian himself, of who was in control. He would fix the glitch. He would restore the connection. He had to. The alternative, a world where Elian was truly, completely gone, was a silence he could not bear to contemplate. The first breath of untainted air was a shock. After weeks in the sterile, sensory-deprived environment of the facility, the atmosphere of his own apartment felt thick, complex, alive with a million motes of dust and the faint, lingering scent of his own life. He stood in the center of the room, feeling the solid floor beneath his feet, the gentle caress of the air currents on his skin. He felt quiet. The constant nagging hum in the back of his mind, the subliminal awareness of Kyle that had been his companion for years, was gone. The silence was absolute. It was vast, terrifying, and exhilarating. He had survived. The final stages of the treatment had been brutal, a controlled demolition of a part of his neural architecture. Dr. Aris had been there, his presence a calm anchor in the storm of disorientation. "The bond is gone, Elian," he had said, his voice soft but certain. "The echo has been silenced. What you do with the quiet is up to you now." He walked to the window. The city spread out below, the same precise, glittering grid. But it looked different. The glass no longer felt like the wall of a cage. It was just a window. He felt a strange emptiness, a hollow space where the bond had been. It was not the ache of longing, it was the disorienting sensation of a phantom limb finally ceasing to throb. He had defined himself by that pain for so long, had structured his life around its ebbs and flows. Who was he without it? For the first time, the question was not a source of despair, but of cautious curiosity. He was a blank slate, a man yet to be written. The chronometer on the wall, the device he had once loathed as a harbinger of his own undoing, glowed with its placid blue light. According to its projections, his next cycle was due to begin within the next 48 hours. The thought did not bring the familiar, metallic taste of dread. Instead, he felt a flicker of scientific detachment. He was an observer of his own biology now, not its victim. What would it be like? A heat that was entirely his own, a biological process without a psychological haunting. He spent the next day rediscovering his own space, his own self. He programmed the food synthesizer to create a meal with strong, spicy flavors he hadn't tasted in years, reveling in the sharp sensation on his tongue. He accessed the public arts archive and filled the silent apartment with complex, atonal music, letting the strange and difficult sounds wash over him. He was recalibrating his senses, reclaiming them from the singular, obsessive focus of the bond. He was learning to live in a world of texture, taste, and sound again, not just a world of scent and fear. As the projected time of his cycle approached, he felt the first faint stirrings, a low warmth in his belly, a subtle heightening of his senses. But it was different. It was a gentle tide rising, not a violent storm. There was no coiling dread in his spine, no feverish panic. His scent began to change, the sweet notes of honey and nightshade beginning to bloom. But they were softer, less desperate. It was an invitation, not a scream. He felt a sense of ownership over the process. This was his body, and it was doing what it was meant to do. There was no shame in it. There was no weakness. There was only life in its messy, organic reality. He was preparing for the heat, laying out cool cloths and water when the chime sounded. Not the soft, melodic chime of a scheduled arrival. This was the harsh, insistent buzz of an unscheduled, unauthorized visitor at the outer door of the residential block. His blood ran cold. It couldn't be. The bond was gone. There was no signal, no summons. He went to the door, his heart beginning to hammer in a familiar, panicked rhythm. He activated the external camera. The image that filled the screen stole the air from his lungs. It was Kyle. He stood in the corridor, his face a mask of cold fury, his broad shoulders tense beneath the severe lines of his regulator uniform. He was not calm. He was not composed. He looked like a storm about to break. He was here, not because of the heat which had barely begun, but for some other reason. A reason that emanated from him in waves of palpable, possessive rage. Elian's hand trembled as he reached for the comms panel. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tight. Kyle's stormy eyes stared directly into the camera lens, as if he could see Elian through the steel and wire. "Open the door, Elian," he said. It was not a request. It was a command, backed by the full, chilling weight of his alpha authority. An authority that no longer had any purchase on Elian's soul, but his body still remembered how to be afraid. The old patterns, the instincts of submission flickered deep within him. But then he remembered the vision in the tank, the cold, calculating look in Kyle's eyes. The leash, the rage, pure and cold, rose to meet the fear, and the rage was stronger. He was not that kneeling Omega anymore. "No," Elian said, the word a small, hard stone of defiance. A flicker of disbelief crossed Kyle's face, quickly replaced by a darker fury. "Do not make me override the security protocols," Kyle warned, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You have no authority here," Elian said, his voice gaining strength. "My file is sealed. You have no jurisdiction. Leave." Kyle's hand balled into a fist at his side. He was losing control, the carefully constructed facade of the impassive regulator cracking to reveal the raw, primal alpha beneath. He had come here to reassert his dominance, and he had been met with a locked door, with denial. It was a challenge he could not abide. "This is not over," Kyle snarled, before turning and striding away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like thunder. Elian stood leaning against the door, his body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. But it was not the trembling of fear or of need. It was the vibration of his own power, a force he had forgotten he possessed. The fight was not over. Kale was right about that, but this time Elian was ready. The final confrontation came sooner than he expected. Hours later, the apartment's main door hissed open without a chime, without warning. The security lock glowed with a red override light. Kyle stood on the threshold, his face shadowed, his presence a vortex of controlled violence that pulled all the light and air in the room toward him. He had used his regulator credentials to force his way in, a flagrant abuse of power that spoke of his desperation. Elian had been expecting it. He didn't flinch. He simply turned from where he was standing by the window and faced him, his heart a steady, cold drum in his chest. The rising heat in his body was a distant warmth, a background hum, not the all-consuming fire it had once been. For the first time, he could face Kale during a cycle and still think. He could feel. He could fight. "You are trespassing," Elian said, his voice level, devoid of the panic Kale had clearly expected. Kale's eyes swept the room, then landed on him. He was searching for the signs of distress, the scent of desperate need. He found only a calm, defiant Omega and a scent that was sweet but self-contained. It was not a plea. The confusion on his face was fleeting, replaced by a dark, simmering rage. "What have you done?" Kale demanded, taking a step into the room. His own scent flooded the space, ozone and stone laced with aggression, a potent, dominating force that should have brought Elian to his knees. It did not. Elian felt the pressure of it, an unpleasant, invasive weight, but the hook that used to catch in his soul was gone. It was just a smell. "I fixed a problem," Elian replied, his voice quiet but resonant. "My problem." "Our bond," Kyle snarled, stalking closer, "is not something you can just fix. It is not a malfunction. It is a part of you, a part of me." "No," Elian said, and the word was sharp, a shard of ice. He did not retreat as Kyle advanced. He stood his ground. It was not a bond. It was a leash, a beautifully designed, one-way instrument of control. "You made sure of that, didn't you?" Kale stopped dead, his composure finally shattering. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a stark, pale mask. He had believed that secret was buried, locked away in a moment Elian could never have truly understood. "You don't know what you're talking about," he bit out, but the denial was weak, transparent. "I know everything," Elian continued, his voice rising with the force of his conviction, the fury he had discovered in the dark finally unleashed. "I saw it. I saw you hesitate. I saw you make the choice to cripple me, to keep me tethered to you like some asset you could keep in reserve. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a fail-safe, a ghost you could visit whenever your perfect, orderly life felt too empty." Every word was a blow, striking at the core of Kale's identity as a man of logic and control. He was being exposed, his motives dissected and laid bare. The regulator was gone. Only the raw, wounded alpha remained. "I did it to protect you," Kyle roared, the sound ripping from his throat, a desperate, last-ditch defense. "You were too volatile, too emotional. A full bond would have destroyed you." "It would have destroyed you," Elian corrected, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "It would have tied you to my instability. It would have compromised your career, your precious advancement. It would have forced you to feel something, and you are a coward, Kale. You hide behind your logic and your regulations because you are terrified of anything you cannot control." A primal growl tore from Kale's chest. He lunged, not with the intention to harm, but to dominate, to physically impose his will where his words had failed. He grabbed Elian by the shoulders, his grip like iron, and tried to force him back, to press him against the wall, to surround him with his size and his scent and remind him of the old hierarchy. But Elian was not the same man. He did not crumble. He did not submit. Fueled by a righteous, cleansing rage, he met Kale's force with his own. He slammed the heels of his hands up under Kyle's chin, the unexpected move snapping the alpha's head back with a sharp crack. Kyle stumbled, his eyes wide with shock. Elian shoved him hard, sending him staggering back. "Get out," Elian commanded, his voice ringing with an authority Kale had never heard from him before. "You are a system error, Kale, a chaotic element masquerading as an agent of order. You talk of managing variables, but you are the biggest variable of all. Your obsession with me, your inability to let go. It's inefficient. It's illogical. It's a corruption in the code." He was using Kale's own language, his own ideology, as a weapon, turning the sterile jargon into a mirror that reflected Kale's own hypocrisy. Kale stared at him, breathing heavily. He saw not the pliant, desperate Omega he had controlled for years, but a stranger, a man who was whole without him, a man who was free. And in his eyes, Kale saw his own defeat. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. He had lost. He had not just lost control of Elian, he had lost a fundamental part of his own self-definition. Without the echo, without the ghost to manage, who was he? Just a man in a sterile apartment with an Omega who did not need him. He turned, his movements stiff, robotic. He walked to the door, a broken machine. He did not look back. The door hissed shut behind him, and this time the silence it left in its wake was clean. It was final. The fever of the heat was still there, a warmth inside him, but it was his. A quiet, steady flame in a house that was no longer haunted. In the days and weeks that followed, a new kind of silence settled into Elian's life. It was not the expectant, dread-filled silence of before, nor the hollow, ringing void of the immediate aftermath. It was a deep, peaceful quiet, the stillness of a calm sea after a hurricane. He learned its textures, its nuances. It was the backdrop against which he began to paint a new life. He never heard from Kale again. He checked the public registries once, out of a lingering clinical curiosity. Kale had been transferred to a remote, undesirable outpost in the outer sectors, a demotion disguised as a reassignment. His perfect, orderly career had been derailed by his own illogical obsession. The system, in its cold, impersonal way, had finally managed the variable. He felt nothing at the news, no satisfaction, no pity, just a distant, final sense of closure. Kyle was a chapter in a book he had finished reading. The memory of him was becoming like a scar, a pale, silvery line on the skin that reminded him he had been wounded, but also that he had healed. His next heat arrived on schedule. He faced it without fear. The experience was transformative. It was a powerful, primal, biological force, but it was not a monster. It was simply a part of him. He moved through it, tending to his body's needs with a sense of gentle mindfulness. The scent of honey and nightshade filled his apartment, but it was a fragrance of life, not of desperation. It was a scent for himself alone. He was no longer a beacon calling for a rescue that was actually a capture. He was simply a man, in his own home, in his own body. He began to make small changes to the apartment. He acquired a plant, a vibrant green fern from a specialty hydroponics vendor. Its living presence was a quiet rebellion against the sterility of the grey walls. He disabled the default, soothing light calibrations, and allowed the real, unfiltered light of the city's sun, a distant white star, to stream through the window in the mornings. He found he liked the sharp, clean lines of the shadows it cast. One day, he received a message from Dr. Aris. It was not a summons for an assessment, but a simple invitation. "There are others like you, Elian. A small group. We talk. We share data. We are building a new vocabulary for what it means to be ourselves. If you are interested." He thought about it for a long time. The solitude had been a necessary crucible, a place to forge his new self. But perhaps it was time to step out of the quiet room and into the world. Perhaps freedom wasn't just about being left alone, but about choosing who to connect with. He sent a simple reply. "I'm interested." He began to dream again. For years, his sleep had been a restless, shallow affair, haunted by a sense of impending dread. Now, he fell into deep, dreamless sleep, and sometimes he would dream of vast, open spaces, an ocean he had only seen in archives, a forest of impossible green, places of wild, untamed, organic chaos. He was not afraid in these dreams. He was exploring. The future was no longer a predictable, regulated timeline stretching into a grey infinity. It was an unknown territory, an open door. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. On the morning he was to meet with Dr. Aris's group, he stood before his window, looking out at the familiar, rigid geometry of the city. He no longer saw a cage. He saw a complex, flawed system built by complex, flawed people. A system that could be changed. A system that could be challenged. A system from which one could, with enough courage, break free. He reached out and pressed the control that would polarize the glass. But then he stopped. On a whim, he found the manual release, a small, recessed latch designed for emergency maintenance. He had to force it. It was stiff from years of disuse, but with a final, groaning click, the seal broke. For the first time, he slid the window open a few inches. The air that flowed in was not the recycled, sterile atmosphere of his apartment. It was real. It was thin and cold, and it carried the faint, metallic tang of the city's industry, the scent of 1,000,000 lives being lived in close proximity. It was imperfect. It was real. He closed his eyes, leaned his head forward, and let the breeze touch his face. It was the first breath of the rest of his life.